Have you heard about the problem of divine hiddenness? The problem is very much what it sounds like. If God exists, why hasn't he made his existence more obvious? Why hasn't God provided mankind with overwhelming proof of his existence? Proof that no human being could possibly miss or ignore. In our day, the problem of divine hiddenness is overtaking the problem of evil as the number one reason why many people say they do not believe in God. If God exists, he should make it more clear to everyone, your neighbor says, while chatting with you over the fence, like Mr. Wilson from Home Improvement, right? You have those conversations. I wonder how you would respond to that neighbor. How would you respond to a friend who confides in you that he once shouted into the night sky, "God, if you're there, show me. Show me some sign and I will believe in you." And there was nothing. Silence. No sign at all. We can all sympathize with that situation, I think, on some level, I'm sure. But how would you respond to that person? If the person's hang-up were merely intellectual, you could give a merely intellectual answer. God probably has good reasons, morally sufficient reasons for only giving us an adequate rather than overwhelming revelation of himself. God has good reasons for giving people enough for any of us to believe, but not so much as to overwhelm anyone. If the hang-up is merely intellectual, that answer alone may be enough to win the day. But much more often than not, the hang-up isn't really intellectual. It's personal. It's emotional. Deep down, we already want something to be true. And however high our feelings rise, to that height, we set our bar for the evidence we'll accept. If we want to believe it, very low bar. If we don't want to believe it, we can set the bar for belief to galactic heights. Let me illustrate what I mean with a story by an Australian named Glenn Scrivener. And the way he told this story, it also happens to rhyme. It's a poem. Here's what Glenn said. "What would make you believe in God?" I asked my friend at the end of a drink. He didn't spend a second to think. He'd been asked before, I figure, had his answer on a hair trigger. "If God," he said, "would reconfigure the stars in the sky to spell the Ten Commandments on high, then I would believe." I don't know how you'd conceive of divine proof, where you'd set your heights. My friend set his to galactic heights. "But," I asked, "would you like this almighty meddler, shuffling nebula, simply to tell you thou shalt not?" Back he shot, "I could never like God. But if he flexed somehow, I'd grudgingly bow." There's a reason why God doesn't write his law in the stars. There's a good reason why God doesn't provide us with overwhelming proof that no one could possibly ignore. We probably wouldn't respond well if he did. We wouldn't like it. We'd internally rebel against it. Loads of people would be just like Glenn's friend in the story who said, "I could never like God. But if he flexed somehow, I begrudgingly bow." Begrudging obedience isn't the kind of obedience that God is after. So God doesn't reveal himself as an almighty meddler, shifting stars to spell out "thou shalt not." There is an element of hiddenness that God maintains for good reasons. But there are also many ways, some of them quite subtle ways, in which God has decided not to hide himself. Psalm 130 that we're looking at this morning gives us three of those ways. Psalm 130 gives us three really good answers to the problem of divine hiddenness, if we care to see them. If you're taking notes this morning, I'm going to give you three headings, and the first is this: God reveals himself in the depths of our problems. The depths of our problems. Look at verses 1 through 4 with me again. Out of the depths I've cried to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. If you, Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But there is forgiveness with you, that you may be feared. To the person who says to me, why doesn't God reveal himself in the sky on high? I ask, have you ever been brought low, friend? Have you ever been brought low? Have your problems and failings ever brought you down to the depths? Have you been brought to the end of yourself, ever? To the end of your ability to cope? If so, what did you find there? Did you, in your hurt, find a witness? A witness you never paid attention to until you were in the depths. C.S. Lewis said that God whispers to us in our pleasures, but shouts at us in our pain. In your time of acute pain, you who have never prayed before, did you find yourself crying out? Did you find yourself in verse 1? Out of the depths I have cried to you. Did you find the urge there, even if you resisted it, to cry to someone who is above the fray? The nigh universal human experience of prayer ought to be a witness to us. It's a witness that we often suppress, especially when things are going well, but when things are bad, when it feels like we're sinking into the depths, when the mirage of our self-sufficiency suddenly vanishes and we feel our utter dependence, we should pay attention to the deepest defaults of our hearts in those moments. We naturally want to pray, don't we? We naturally want to cry out. Our default wiring at those times is to cry out to God. This is part of God's witness, hardwired into us. We hear that witness loudest when we are in the depths. I think you probably already know this experientially, but let me give you an illustration to help this stick. Did you know that in the daytime, you can still see the light of distant stars if you find yourself down in the bottom of a deep, dark well? In the depths, you can focus on distant points of light and your vision becomes clearer. When we are down in the pit, when we feel our need most keenly, God's hand is most visible. His presence is often the most palpable. So, don't despise the depths. If you're there this morning, do not despise the depths. But ask yourself, what amount of trouble would I willingly go through if it resulted in knowing God a little better? What depths would you willingly go down into for a clearer sight of God? Or for a first saving glimpse? No tragedy is really tragic if it results in you knowing God forever. Amen. So, don't write off, don't totally despise your present problems. They can be Job-like opportunities to cry to God and to come to know more of Him. Or maybe just to come to know Him, period. Psalm 130 points us to this deep-rooted instinct, the instinct to cry out to God when we feel ourselves out of our depths. when we feel the depths of our problems, and particularly when we feel the depths of our sin. You see that? Look again at verse 3. If you, Lord, should mark iniquities, sin, O Lord, who could stand? Your moral compass, your moral intuitions are also a good argument against divine hiddenness. God has written what's right and wrong upon your heart. And deep down, you know that you've messed it all up in some way. I remember reading in the early days of my seminary career some prayers from ancient Mesopotamia, as one does in seminary, right, John? These prayers predate Moses, predate the Bible, and rang true enough to be recorded and copied and used in worship, in pagan worship, but in worship. The original writers addressed these prayers to the god or goddess that I do not know. And the most often repeated ideas were these: God that I do not know, I do know that I've offended you. Though I do not know exactly what I've done, I know I've gotten it wrong. I do know that things are broken, and somehow I broke the relationship with the goddess I do not know. But I have no idea how to make it right again. As far back as written language and history will take us, people have had a sense of sin, a sense of the world being broken, and a sense that we were the ones that broke it somehow. Mankind is paid this high honor at least. We're significant enough to break things. Try as we might to fix things, to prove ourselves, and to gain approval, in our most honest moments, listening to our most ancient instincts, we feel the truth of verse 3. If you, Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? None of us. No one. We feel the depths of our sin, and that's a good thing. That's a necessary thing. Because if we can't feel the full extent of our faults and find ourselves in verse 3, then we'll proceed on through life foolishly thinking we can be our own saviors. Foolishly thinking that we can be good enough to gain God's full acceptance. And we won't. We won't be able to stand in the judgment unless we see our guilt in advance and look for a way of salvation. Unless we feel the weight of our sin in advance and feel our need for a Savior. We've got to own the bad news of sin before we can feel the good news of verse 4. Look at verse 4. But there is forgiveness with you, that you may be feared. Deep problems, such as ours, require deeper solutions. We had a deep problem. If God is just, then there is no way that we will be able to stand blameless before Him. No one will be counted innocent when the judge can see our every hidden motive. A person might think the problem is with God's hiddenness, but the one who is hidden can also see what is hidden. God can see not just what you did, but why you did it. How much selfish manipulation of others, including those we love, has He seen in us, in our hearts? How much envy? How much baseless pride? How much pandering for praise and approval? How much lust disguised as love? How will we fare when the browser history of our hearts is put on display? How will we fare when we realize too late that there is no incognito mode when it comes to God? When we wake up to those realities, another deeper desire awakens as well. we realize our desperate need for forgiveness. We're awakened to our need for mercy. Deep problems require deeper solutions. The Old Testament gives hints at how God can solve our deepest problem. Just how can God keep his justice and forgive sins? The Old Testament gives hints, but it doesn't solve it for us. It remains a mystery until we get to the New Testament, where the mystery is finally revealed. I expect you probably already know the answer to the great mystery of how God can maintain his justice and able to forgive sins. But if you don't, I'm going to keep you in suspense for just a little while longer. Before we get there, let's see our second heading. Second heading is this: the heights of our expectations. The heights of our expectations. This is another answer to divine hiddenness. God points to himself in the heights of our expectations. Look at verses 5 and 6. I wait for the Lord, my soul does wait, and in his word do I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning, indeed more than watchmen for the morning. Put yourself this morning in the shoes of watchmen, expectantly waiting for the dawn. The night is your time of work, but it's also your time of worry. You've got to stay up and watch until morning because night is the time of danger. There's an enemy out there, one that comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Nighttime is synonymous with fear. For you as a watchman, for the night to give way to morning would be like your fear giving way to relief. Your time of work giving way to your time of rest. Your time of danger in the darkness giving way to a time of peace in the dawning day. Atop the battlements of Helm's Deep, Aragorn spoke these words: dawn is ever the hope of men. And it's true. This age often feels like darkness. This feels like our time of toil and danger, but deep down, we also feel as though we were made for something more. Do you feel it? We were made for the dawn, not the darkness. Deep down, we long for another, better world where darkness and fear are forever things of the past. If I quote C.S. Lewis again at this point, I bet some of you already know. You can probably guess what that quote will be. They can at my church. Lewis said, "If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most logical explanation is what? I was made for another world." Many of you know that quote probably already by heart, but do you know the original context of it? It's from Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis's larger argument is this. He says, the Christian says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care on the one hand never to despise or to be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for something else of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. Here's the point, which Lewis has made and many others have made. which Psalm 130 made a long time ago. If we find ourselves longing, particularly this watchman-like longing for the dawn, this watchman-like longing for God, if we find this in ourselves, we should recognize these longings for what they really are. Witnesses and pointers to what we were really made for, to the world we were really meant to inhabit, a world with God, who we see face to face. If we were merely the product of evolutionary conditioning, if we were merely highly evolved apes, then every deep desire and longing in us should have a corresponding fulfillment in the physical, natural world. But it doesn't. But if we find in ourselves a deep-seated itch that nothing in the world can scratch, the most likely conclusion is that we were made for something more. You were made for something more. While some things do whet our appetite, the sweet fellowship of friends and family, the satisfaction of enjoying a good book, the taste of good food and the comforts of home, while these things do whet an appetite, they never fully satisfy, because they were always intended to arouse our longing, like a copy or an echo of the real thing. G.K. Chesterton said that Christianity was what finally made sense of a feeling that he had had since childhood. How he could be homesick while being at home. You ever had that feeling before? Homesick while being at home. The heights of our expectations and desires and longings all point us to this discovery. We are waiting for something. We are waiting for someone. We are waiting for a fulfillment that feels like daybreak after darkness. Post tenebras lux, after darkness, light. The heights of our expectations point to the reality of God, of a God who made us for himself. There's a third element in the psalm that pulls back the curtain on divine hiddenness, and it's this: the content of our hopes. The content of our hopes. Look with me, verses 7 and 8. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is loving kindness, and with him is abundant redemption, and he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. Let me speak a hope out loud that I believe you have, but perhaps have never spoken. Whether you're a believer or an unbeliever, religious or irreligious, Christian, atheist, agnostic, I think you have this hope deep down, that at the very heart of reality itself, you hope to find love. Love. People who don't believe in anything supernatural, in anything above or beyond nature, still in their heart of hearts hope for this: for love to be real and to be at the center of all things. As an atheist, you may have that intuition, but you don't have a way to defend that intuition if nature is a book only read in tooth and claw. In that case, love is nothing more than a survival mechanism. And not a very good survival mechanism, because love often leads us to lay down our lives and our rights for the ones we love. It is the anti-survival mechanism. Your head may agree with Tennyson's famous line. You know that's Tennyson. Nature is red in tooth and claw. But your heart knows that how Tennyson ended the poem is really more true. You know how that poem ends? "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." You know that's true. You know the primary importance of love. I think you want to believe that love is at the center of all things, that love is fundamental to the universe, but you don't know how to believe it. You don't have the grounds to believe it unless you come to believe verse 7. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is loving kindness. To hope in this God is to hope in the source of all love. He is the one from whom all loving kindness flows. For the Christian, the content of our hope is really built upon the content of God's character. Because if God exists, the content of his character must be the centerpiece of all reality. Because all reality flows from him. If you intuit that deep down, like me, that love should be at the center of all things, then you have little choice but to become a believer in God, my friend. You need to become a believer in this God, the God who says, I am love. God is love. If Psalm 130 is true, then love is fundamental to reality, as well as something else. Loving kindness is woven into the fabric of reality, and so is redemption. Look at the rest of verse 7. For with the Lord there is loving kindness, and with him there is abundant redemption. If Psalm 130 is true, then human history is fundamentally a redemptive story. Which means your story can fundamentally be a redemptive story. Again, you may have never voiced this before, but I bet deep down, this is what you want to be true. This is what you are wired to want. A righting of all wrongs, especially the wrongs that you've done. You want the redemption of all your hurts. In the words of Samwise Gamgee, you long for the day when all the sad things will become untrue, don't you? I do. All the sad things become untrue. Deep down, you feel the need for redemption. And deep down, you hope your story will be a redemptive story. You don't want your story to be a morality tale where you get what you deserve. You want your story to be a redemptive story, a story of redemption, where we get the happy ending that we don't deserve. But there is no real love, nor any real redemption if we are just the mere accidental collision of atoms. In that case, love is just a chemical reaction in the brain. Redemption is just an artificial construct that we impose upon reality. Even if you say you believe that, I bet you don't live that way. I bet you don't live like love is just neurons firing and brain chemistry, that redemption isn't real. You don't kiss your mama with that worldview, do you? I don't think so. We all know there is a real content to these realities, and we cannot be satisfied to live with anything less. We find ourselves hardwired to have hope, to hope in the reality of love, to hope in the reality of redemption. Old Testament passages like Psalm 130 set the table for those realities. But Jesus is the feast. Remember Glenn Scrivener's friend who was complaining of divine hiddenness, demanding that God write his law in the stars? Here's the rest of the story. Glenn asked, would you like this almighty meddler, shuffling nebula, simply to tell you thou shalt not? Back he shot, I could never like God, but if he flexed somehow, I'd grudgingly bow. I said, now we agree. We both opt out of that God that you doubt. But have you considered what Easter's about? There's a doubter called Thomas, a little like you. He too had a test. He said, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and touch the wound where the spear was rammed, I will not believe. He soon received his demand. The butchered God arose to stand and stretch out his hands and say, look, see, reach out, believe, and do not doubt. Of course, Thomas cried, seeing hands inside, you are my Lord and my God. So in the end, I say to my friend, here is the faith-giving sight. Maimed and magnificent, wounded, omnipotent, a warrior back from the fight. Do you have suspicions? Forget cosmic magicians. See this battle-scarred, conquering knight. You look for God, but you will fail to see if you raise your gaze to the stars. Easter would teach us to lower our sights. His story, he writes in the scars. The problem of divine hiddenness vanishes into thin air when it encounters Jesus Christ. The one who says, how can you say, show us the Father? He who has seen me has seen the Father. Jesus is God in flesh. The one who in love and abundant redemption says in his embodied sacrifice, don't look up for signs in the stars, but from your depths of woe, look upon me and find your redemption in my scars.